Property Owner Files, Season 1, Episode 1. Title: My tenant stopped paying and refused to leave. Is being a landlord really passive income? On social media, real estate looks simple. Buy property, rent it out, collect checks. But behind closed doors, there's another side of property ownership most people never talk about. Welcome to Property Owner Files, where real landlords share the stories they wish they'd heard before they bought property. These aren't theories. These aren't headlines. These are real landlord horror stories. Beat. Let's get into today's file. My tenant stopped paying and refused to leave. Is being a landlord worth it? That's the question one property owner asked themselves the moment the rent didn't show up. At first it seemed small. Just one missed payment. Then another. Calls went unanswered. Excuses piled up. And before long, the tenant made something very clear. They weren't paying, and they weren't leaving. Today on Property Owner Files, we're opening a case that plays out every single day in real estate. A tenant stops paying rent, knows the system, and uses it to stay put for months. And the scariest part? This story isn't rare. Stick around because by the end you'll understand why this moment is where many landlords realize property ownership is anything but passive. When the rent stops. It usually doesn't happen all at once. The first missed payment comes with an apology. Something came up. Next week for sure. As a landlord, you want to believe them. After all, evictions are uncomfortable. Nobody wants conflict. So you wait. Then next month comes. No payment. More excuses. By month 3, the tone changes. Messages get shorter. Calls go unanswered. And that's when the reality hits. The tenant knows exactly what they're doing. In many states, once a tenant stops paying, the eviction clock doesn't start until proper notice is given. And even then, the process can take months. Meanwhile, the landlord is still paying the mortgage, still paying taxes, still paying insurance. This is the moment real estate stops feeling like an investment and starts feeling like a liability. And what comes next is where things get even worse. If you think missing rent is bad, wait until you hear what happens once eviction begins. The legal trap. Serving an eviction notice feels empowering at first. You think, okay, the process has started, but what most new landlords don't realize is how tenant-friendly the system can be. The tenant contests the eviction. Court dates get delayed. Paperwork gets challenged. Weeks turn into months. And during this entire time, the tenant is legally allowed to stay, without paying rent. Some tenants even stop communicating entirely. They know the rules. They know the timeline. And they know the landlord is bleeding money every single day. This is where landlord horror stories are born. Because the longer the tenant stays, the higher the stakes get. Repairs are ignored. Maintenance requests pile up. Tension rises. And that's when landlords start to worry about what's happening inside the property. Still watching? You won't believe what the landlord found when they finally got access. What happens behind closed doors? When the eviction finally moves forward, landlords expect relief. What they often get instead is shock. In this case, the tenant had stopped caring entirely. Trash piled up. Food left out. Leaks ignored. By the time the landlord could legally enter, the apartment had begun to deteriorate from the inside. Mold formed in hidden places. Pests moved in. Minor issues became major damages. And here's the part that hits hardest. The landlord couldn't do anything sooner. This is one of the most frustrating truths about property ownership. You own the house. You pay for everything. But when a tenant refuses to cooperate, your control disappears. And just when you think the nightmare is almost over, the tenant digs in even deeper. If you thought this was bad, wait until you hear what the tenant did next. I'm not leaving. Eviction day finally arrives. The landlord expects the unit to be empty. It isn't. The tenant refuses to leave. Claims paperwork wasn't served correctly. Demands more time. Threatens legal action. The sheriff is called. More delays. This phase is where emotional exhaustion sets in. The landlord isn't just losing money, they're losing sleep. Every day the tenant stays means more unpaid rent, more potential damage, more stress, and worst of all, there's no guarantee the tenant will leave the property in livable condition. This is the moment many landlords quietly ask themselves a question they never expected to ask. Why did I get into real estate in the first place? And the ending of this story answers that question in a way most investors don't expect. The aftermath. When the tenant finally left, the landlord expected relief. Instead, they found silence and destruction, damaged flooring, broken fixtures, a unit that needed weeks of repairs before it could be rented again. Between unpaid rent, legal fees, and damages, the financial loss was devastating. But the emotional cost was worse. This wasn't just a bad tenant. It was a wake-up call. This story represents thousands of landlords who enter real estate believing it's passive, predictable, and safe, only to learn that tenants are the biggest variable in property ownership. And this was just episode 1. Because in the next file, the rent doesn't just stop, the tenant disappears entirely. This story wasn't rare. It happens every day in real estate. And in the next episode of Property Owner Files, the tenant doesn't fight eviction. They vanish, leaving behind a problem that costs even more. Click the next episode to open the next file. Because the stories only get worse from here.